This is a true story shared in 2014 on a forum dedicated to cave explorers. For Matt, Ryan, and Corey, cave exploration wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. Every year, they took time off from their mundane jobs to venture into uncharted caverns, armed with little more than headlamps, ropes, and a shared thirst for adventure. This summer, their target was a little-known cave system deep in the Ozark Mountains. Its name was nowhere to be found on maps, and it was spoken of only in hushed tones by the few locals willing to acknowledge its existence. I found a reference to it in an old forum thread, Corey had said weeks earlier, excitement lighting up his face. They called it the Hollow Gate. No one seems to know much about it, but it's supposed to be massive and untouched. Ryan had frowned. If no one knows much about it, maybe there's a reason for that. Exactly. Corey had exclaimed, "It could be our big find!" On a misty morning, the three friends parked their truck at the edge of a forest trail. They unloaded their gear, the crisp mountain air tingling with anticipation. Ryan, ever the cautious one, hesitated as they stood before the dense woods. "You sure this is a good idea?" he asked, adjusting his pack. Matt smirked. "Come on, Ryan. You're always looking for a reason to back out. Let's just find the entrance and see where it takes us." Corey pointed to the GPS coordinates on his phone. The forum thread said the entrance is marked by a split boulder, about 2 miles in. Let's get moving. The hike was uneventful, save for the occasional crow cawing in the distance. The forest felt unusually quiet, as if it were holding its breath. "Anyone else think it's too still out here?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence. Corey rolled his eyes. "It's a forest, not a highway. What do you expect?" But even Matt couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over him. He glanced at the map in his hand, trying to focus on the task at hand. When they finally reached the split boulder, the entrance to the cave was unmistakable. A dark, jagged opening yawned at the base of a rocky outcrop, as if the earth itself were inviting them in. "Wow," Corey whispered, his voice tinged with awe. Ryan shivered. "It looks wrong." Matt clapped him on the shoulder. "It's just a hole in the ground, man. Let's gear up." The first hour inside the cave was thrilling. The walls glistened with moisture, their headlamps casting eerie shadows across the uneven surfaces. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the air was cool and damp. But as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a faint sound, a rhythmic dripping that seemed to echo far too loudly. "Is it me, or does that sound off?" Ryan asked, stopping to listen. Matt tilted his head. "Just water. Let's keep going." Corey, who was leading the way, suddenly froze. "Wait, did you hear that?" "What now?" Matt asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Corey turned slowly, his face pale. "I thought I heard footsteps behind us." They all stood still, straining to hear, but the cave was silent. Shaking off the unease, they continued onward, their nerves fraying with each step. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. As they moved through the tight space, Ryan felt a sudden tug on his boot. "Hey!" he shouted, twisting around. "What?" Matt asked, his headlamp illuminating Ryan's panicked face. "Something grabbed me," Ryan stammered, his voice trembling. "Probably got caught on a rock," Corey said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But as they pressed forward, the sense of being watched became impossible to ignore. The whispers began soon after. Soft, unintelligible murmurs echoed through the cavern, seeming to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "I don't like this," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "We should go back." "Not yet," Corey insisted, though even he sounded uncertain. "We've come this far. Let's see where this leads." But none of them could shake the feeling that they weren't alone, and that whatever was in the cave didn't want them there. The air inside the cave seemed heavier the further they ventured, as if the weight of the earth above them was pressing down on their lungs. The soft murmurs they'd heard earlier had faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ryan clutched his flashlight tightly, his knuckles pale. "I don't care what you say, Corey. Something doesn't feel right about this place." Corey, leading the group with his usual bravado, didn't turn around. "That's just your imagination. Caves do that. They play tricks on your senses." But even Matt, who usually sided with Corey, couldn't help but feel the oppressive tension in the air. "Let's just keep moving and see if we can find anything interesting. Then we'll head back." The passageway widened suddenly, opening into a vast chamber. Their headlamps flickered against the towering walls, illuminating stalagmites rising like jagged spears from the floor. The ceiling soared above them, disappearing into darkness. "Whoa!" Corey breathed. "This is incredible! Look at the size of this place!" Ryan, however, was less impressed. "It's big, sure, but why does it feel so off?" Matt walked toward the center of the chamber, his boots crunching on loose gravel. He shone his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the gloom. "Over here!" he called. The others joined him, their lights converging on a peculiar rock formation. It looked almost sculpted, rows of smooth, curved ridges that seemed too deliberate to be natural. "What do you think it is?" Matt asked, crouching to get a closer look. Corey squinted, his curiosity piqued. Maybe erosion, or... He trailed off, unable to explain the strange pattern. Ryan stepped back, uneasy. "I don't like this. Let's get out of here." As they debated their next move, a faint sound echoed through the chamber, a high-pitched, almost melodic whistle. "Did you hear that?" Corey asked, his voice hushed. Matt nodded, his eyes scanned it. "It came from that tunnel," he said, pointing toward a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber. Ryan shook his head vehemently. "No way. We're not going in there." But Corey was already moving toward the tunnel, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "We've come this far. We can't just stop now." Reluctantly, Matt followed. Ryan lingered behind, his heart pounding. "This is a bad idea," he muttered, before jogging to catch up. The tunnel was narrower than they'd anticipated, forcing them to crouch as they moved through. The whistle grew louder, though its source remained elusive. "Does anyone else think that sounds alive?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Corey laughed nervously. "It's probably just the wind. These caves can do weird things with sound." But as they rounded a bend, the whistling abruptly stopped. "What the?" Corey muttered, his voice trailing off. Ahead of them, the tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller but more foreboding. The walls were lined with strange, claw-like markings, as if something or someone had carved them with deliberate intent. Ryan stepped back, panic flashing across his face. "This isn't normal. We need to go. Now." Before anyone could respond, a soft scraping noise echoed from behind them. They spun around, their flashlights darting across the narrow tunnel. "Did you see that?" Corey whispered, his voice barely audible. Matt shook his head, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "See what?" "I thought I saw a shadow, something moving." Ryan was already retreating toward the exit. "I'm not staying here to find out what it was. Let's go." But as they turned to leave, the scraping sound came again, closer this time. They froze, their breath caught in their throats. And then, from the darkness, came the faintest hint of movement, a small silhouette darting across the edge of their light. The three friends stood frozen, their flashlights fixed on the spot where the shadow had disappeared. The silence in the tunnel seemed to press against their ears, amplifying the pounding of their hearts. "Did you see that?" Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. Corey nodded slowly, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "Yeah, I saw it." Matt's eyes darted nervously around the chamber. "It could have been an animal? Maybe a bat?" Ryan shook his head. "No, that was on the ground. It wasn't flying, and it looked too small to be anything normal." The scraping sound came again, echoing faintly from deeper within the tunnel. It was rhythmic now, almost deliberate, like claws against stone. "We need to leave," Ryan said, his voice firm. Corey hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. "It's probably just some wildlife. We've dealt with weird noises in caves before." "This isn't the same," Ryan snapped. "You know it isn't." Matt stepped between them, trying to diffuse the tension. "Let's backtrack to the main chamber and regroup. If it's nothing, we can keep exploring. But if it's something, we're not prepared for this." Reluctantly, Corey agreed, and the three began retracing their steps through the narrow tunnel. The air felt colder now, each breath misting in the beam of their flashlights. But as they moved, the sound followed them. The scraping grew louder, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Ryan stopped abruptly, his flashlight shaking. "Do you hear that? The whispers?" Matt nodded, his face pale. "It's like they're coming from everywhere." Corey's bravado was starting to crack. "Okay, I admit it. This is freaking me out." As they reached the larger chamber, they felt a wave of relief. The open space seemed less suffocating, and for a moment the noises stopped. But their relief was short-lived. Matt pointed to the ground near the strange rock formation they'd examined earlier. That wasn't there before. The others followed his gaze. Small footprints, no larger than a child's, were imprinted in the soft dirt. They formed a trail that led from the tunnel they had just exited to another dark passageway on the opposite side of the chamber. Ryan's face twisted in fear. "Tell me those aren't footprints." "They are," Corey admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Before they could decide what to do next, the faint whistle returned, this time echoing from the new passageway. It was accompanied by a faint glow, like the flicker of a distant flame. Ryan took a step back, panic overtaking him. "I'm done. I'm not going any further." Matt, however, seemed transfixed by the glow. "It's like someone's down there. Maybe another group?" "Another group wouldn't be leaving footprints like that," Ryan said sharply. Corey glanced between the two, his internal debate visible on his face. "We can't just ignore it. What if someone needs help?" "No one needs help," Ryan shouted. "Whatever this is, it's not normal." As they argued, the glow began to move, growing brighter as it drifted toward them. "Okay, that's it. I'm out," Ryan declared, turning toward the entrance. But before he could take another step, the glow disappeared, and the chamber was plunged into silence. "What the hell is going on?" Corey muttered, his bravado now completely gone. Matt was about to respond when a new sound echoed through the chamber, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. Ryan grabbed Corey's arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to go. Now." Corey didn't argue this time. The three of them bolted for the entrance, their footsteps echoing wildly in the cavernous space. As they ran, the growl followed them, growing louder with each step. Shadows danced on the walls, as if something was chasing them. By the time they reached the cave entrance, they were gasping for breath, their hearts racing. They didn't stop until they were back at their car, the cave entrance now a distant speck in the darkening landscape. Slamming the car door shut, Ryan leaned back, his chest heaving. "We are never going back there." But Corey stared out the window, his expression unreadable. "We have to. We need to know what we saw." Matt said nothing, but deep down, he agreed. They couldn't leave the mystery unsolved. The drive back to town was a silent one. Ryan gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, while Corey stared out the window, lost in thought. Matt sat in the back seat, replaying the events in his mind, every strange sound, every fleeting shadow. When they finally pulled into Corey's driveway, no one moved to get out. The silence hung heavy in the air until Ryan finally spoke. "That was messed up," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't care what you two think, but I'm done with that cave." Corey turned to face him, his expression serious. "You can't just pretend this didn't happen. We all saw the footprints, heard the noises. Something's in there, and we need to figure out what." Ryan shook his head firmly. "You're insane. Whatever's in there isn't something we're meant to mess with. You saw how it followed us. It wanted us out. Or it wanted us to come back," Matt muttered, almost to himself. Ryan shot him a look in the rearview mirror. "What's that supposed to mean?" Matt hesitated before answering. "The glow, the whispers, it was like it was leading us somewhere. It didn't feel random." Corey nodded. "Exactly. It's like the cave is hiding something. Something important." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. Or something dangerous. Over the next few days, the cave was all any of them could think about. Ryan tried to push the memory aside, throwing himself into work and ignoring calls from the others. But Corey and Matt were relentless, poring over maps and online forums, searching for any mention of strange activity in the area. Finally, they found something, a post on an obscure caving forum. It was vague, but the author described a series of tunnels in the same region that seemed alive. The post mentioned strange noises, sudden temperature drops, and the feeling of being watched. "That's it," Corey said, showing the post to Matt. "It matches everything we experienced." Matt frowned. "But the post doesn't say where the tunnels are exactly, just that they're near the ridge." Corey leaned back in his chair, frustrated. If we could just get Ryan on board, we'd have a better chance of finding it again. It took hours of convincing, but eventually Ryan agreed to meet them for coffee. He sat across from Corey and Matt, arms crossed and a scowl on his face. "This better be good," he said. Corey slid the forum post across the table. "Look at this. Someone else has experienced the same thing. We're not crazy." Ryan skimmed the post, his expression softening slightly. "Okay, so someone else heard noises in a cave. Big deal. That doesn't mean we should go back. But what if it's more than that? Matt pressed. What if there's something in there no one's ever discovered before? Something that could change everything? Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. And what if it's something that gets us killed? We barely made it out last time. Corey leaned forward, his voice low. Don't you want answers, Ryan? Don't you want to know what we saw? For a long moment, Ryan said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded. Fine. But if we're doing this, we're going prepared. No more stumbling around in the dark. Over the next week, they gathered supplies, better flashlights, climbing gear, and even a handheld camera to document their findings. They studied the map carefully, marking potential routes and exits. On the day of their return, the mood was tense but determined. They stood at the base of the ridge, staring at the cave entrance. It looked different now, smaller somehow, less inviting. You sure about this? Ryan asked, glancing at Corey. Corey adjusted his pack. No, but we're doing it anyway. With that, they stepped into the darkness once more. The cave was eerily quiet as they ventured deeper, the faint hum from their equipment echoing off the walls. Unlike their first visit, there was no casual banter to fill the silence, just the sound of boots scraping against the rocky floor and the occasional drip of water. Ryan led the way, his new high-powered flashlight sweeping across the tunnel walls. Corey followed close behind, holding the map they'd marked up from memory, while Matt brought up the rear, the camera strapped to his chest. As they walked, Corey pointed to a fork ahead. Left. This should take us back toward the chamber with the glowing rocks. Ryan hesitated at the intersection, glancing down the other tunnel. And what if it doesn't? What if we get lost again? Corey's jaw tightened. We won't. Just trust me. Reluctantly, Ryan turned left, his flashlight illuminating the narrow passage ahead. The further they went, the colder it got. Their breath became visible, misting in the light. Matt stopped briefly to adjust his camera, his fingers numb and clumsy. Why is it so cold? He muttered. Caves can have temperature drops, Corey said, though he didn't sound convinced. Ryan glanced over his shoulder. Yeah, but this feels unnatural. As if on cue, a faint sound echoed through the tunnel, a soft, almost rhythmic tapping. They froze. What was that? Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan slowly scanned the flashlight beam across the walls. Probably water dripping. Let's keep moving. But as they continued, the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't water, it was something knocking against the stone. When they reached the chamber with the glowing rocks, Corey let out a shaky breath. Here it is. We're on the right track. Ryan crouched beside one of the rocks, examining it closely. The glow was faint but undeniable, like embers that refused to die out. He reached out to touch it, but Corey grabbed his wrist. Don't, Corey said. We don't know what it is. Ryan pulled his hand back, standing up. Fine, but we should collect some samples. If we can prove these are real, maybe people will take us seriously. Matt knelt beside the rock, positioning his camera to capture the faint luminescence. I'm getting this on tape. No one can say we made it up now. As he filmed, the tapping sound returned, closer this time. It seemed to be coming from the tunnel they'd just come through. Corey's grip on the map tightened. We're not alone. Ryan swung his flashlight toward the tunnel entrance, his heart pounding. Whatever's in here better stay back. The beam landed on a shadow, a small humanoid figure darting out of sight. Did you see that? Matt hissed, scrambling to his feet. Yeah, Ryan said, his voice grim. I saw it. They backed away from the tunnel entrance, their eyes darting around the chamber. The tapping grew louder, joined by a faint whispering sound like wind moving through narrow crevices. What do we do? Matt asked, panic creeping into his voice. We stick together, Corey said firmly, and we don't run. That's how people get hurt in caves. Ryan nodded, though his hands were shaking. Right, no running. But let's not stay here either. They turned toward another tunnel, one that Corey had marked on the map as a potential exit route. As they moved, the shadows seemed to shift around them, the faint glow of the rocks casting eerie patterns on the walls. The whispering followed them, growing louder with each step. Matt glanced back, his camera still rolling. It's like they're hurting us. Corey shot him a warning look. Don't think about it. Just keep moving. When they finally emerged into another chamber, the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. Ryan collapsed onto a rock, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. What the hell are those things? Corey shook his head. I don't know, but they're smart. They're organized. Matt adjusted the camera strap, his face pale. Do you think they're trying to protect something? Like the rocks? Maybe, Corey said. Or maybe we're just in their territory, and they don't want us here. Ryan stood up, his expression grim. Either way, we need to get out of here. Now. Corey studied the map, tracing their route with his finger. There's another exit tunnel about a mile from here. If we're lucky, it'll take us outside. Ryan snorted. When have we ever been lucky in this cave? Corey ignored the comment, folding the map. Let's move. As they entered the next tunnel, the air grew warmer, almost suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the ground felt uneven, like it was shifting beneath their feet. The tapping started again, louder and more frantic than before. Ryan turned to Corey, his voice trembling. Are you sure this is the right way? Corey hesitated, then nodded. It has to be, but the doubt in his voice was impossible to miss. The tunnel narrowed as they pressed onward, the walls squeezing tighter until they were forced to walk single file. The air was damp and heavy, carrying an earthy smell that clung to their clothes. The tapping sound persisted, echoing off the walls, and with each step, it seemed to grow closer. Ryan glanced over his shoulder at Matt, who was walking behind him. Keep that camera rolling. If anything happens to us, someone needs to know what went down here. Not helping Ryan, Corey snapped from the front. Matt nodded, his grip tightening on the camera. It's already rolling. The path ahead sloped downward, the footing growing treacherous. Loose rocks tumbled under their boots, the echoes blending with the persistent tapping. Suddenly, Corey stopped, holding up a hand. What is it? His voice hushed. Corey pointed ahead, where the tunnel widened into another chamber. The faint glow of the rocks was visible again. But this time, it wasn't the only source of light. Small, flickering shadows danced along the walls as if cast by a fire. What's making that light? Matt whispered. Corey didn't answer. He crouched low, creeping toward the chamber's edge. The others followed, their movements careful and silent. As they peeked inside, all three froze. The chamber was larger than any they'd seen so far, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Wrapped in the center stood a cluster of the glowing rocks, arranged in a crude circle. Surrounding the circle were small humanoid figures, at least a dozen of them. The creatures were no taller than children, their bodies thin and wiry. Their skin was pale and mottled, blending with the stone around them. They moved with an unsettling grace, their long fingers gently tapping against the glowing rocks. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. What are they? Corey shook his head slowly. I don't know, but they're not just animals. They're doing something. Matt's camera whirred softly as he zoomed in, capturing the scene. This is insane. No one's going to believe this. One of the creatures paused, its head snapping up. Large, reflective eyes scanned the chamber before locking onto the tunnel entrance. They see us, Corey hissed. The creatures let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a warning growl. One by one, they turned toward the tunnel, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Back up, Corey whispered, his voice tense. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He began retreating, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The creatures didn't move at first. They simply watched, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. Then, as if responding to some silent command, they started toward the tunnel, their movements quick and fluid. Run, Corey said, his voice rising. They bolted, the sound of their boots pounding against the rocky floor echoing in the narrow tunnel. The tapping had turned into a frantic clattering, the creature's pursuit unmistakable. Don't stop, Corey shouted over his shoulder. Matt stumbled but caught himself, clutching the camera to his chest. They're right behind us. Ryan risked a glance back, his flashlight beam catching the pale forms scrambling over the rocks. They moved like spiders, their limbs bending in unnatural ways as they gained on the group. This way, Corey yelled, veering into a side tunnel. The new tunnel was even narrower, forcing them to duck and squeeze through tight spaces. The creatures followed relentlessly, their guttural sounds echoing closer with each passing moment. Ryan's chest burned as he gasped for air. We're not going to make it! Yes, we will, Corey snapped, determination blazing in his eyes. Just keep moving. The tunnel opened up into another chamber, this one smaller and featureless. Corey scanned the walls, searching for another exit. There, he said, pointing to a narrow crevice in the far wall. Without hesitation, they squeezed through, the rock scraping against their clothes and skin. The creatures reached the chamber just as they disappeared into the crevice. One of them let out a shrill, piercing sound like a scream, and the others joined in. The noise was deafening, reverberating through the tunnel as the three friends crawled as fast as they could. "Don't stop," Corey urged, his voice barely audible over the din. They emerged into another tunnel, this one sloping upward. The air was fresher, carrying a faint breeze. "Up ahead!" Ryan shouted, spotting a faint glimmer of light. They sprinted toward it, their legs burning with exhaustion. The creatures' screams faded behind them, but none of them dared to slow down. When they finally burst out into the open air, the sun was setting, casting the forest in a warm, golden glow. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. Ryan sat up, his face pale. What the hell just happened? Corey shook his head, staring back at the cave entrance. "I don't know, but whatever's down there, it's not natural." Matt adjusted the camera, checking the footage. "I got it all on tape. People have to see this." Corey's gaze hardened. "We need to go back. With more people, better equipment. We need to figure out what's really down there." Ryan's stomach churned at the thought. "You're insane if you think I'm going back in there." But as the three of them sat in the fading light, they all knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The journey back to the motel was marked by an eerie silence. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, the adrenaline of their escape still coursing through their veins. Ryan drove, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Corey sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, while Matt was in the back, reviewing the footage on his camera. The glowing eyes, the humanoid creatures, their synchronized movements. It was all there. "Do you think anyone's going to believe this?" Matt finally asked, breaking the silence. Ryan snorted, his voice tinged with frustration. "No. And honestly, I'm not sure I even believe it." "It happened," Corey said firmly. "We all saw it. This isn't something we can just forget about." When they arrived at the motel, exhaustion hit them like a wave. But despite their fatigue, none of them could sleep. Instead, they gathered around Matt's camera, watching the footage again. The images were even more unsettling in the cold clarity of the screen. The creatures' pale, wiry forms moved with an unnatural fluidity, their reflective eyes glinting in the dim light. The shrill scream that had echoed through the tunnel sent shivers down their spines. "This has to be worth something," Matt said, his voice a mix of excitement and trepidation. "If we show this to the right people, it could blow the lid off everything we know about these caves." Corey nodded, but his expression was grim. "Or it could get us laughed out of the room. You know how people are. They'll call it a hoax, say we faked it." Ryan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "So what do we do? Go back? Prove it wasn't a one-time thing." The room fell silent as the question hung in the air. Finally, Corey spoke, his voice steady. "We need a plan. We can't just charge back in there without knowing what we're dealing with. And we definitely can't do it alone." Matt hesitated. "What if the cave isn't there anymore? What if we can't find it again?" Corey frowned. "It'll be there. It has to be. We marked the spot on the map." Ryan's gaze shifted toward the window, where the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. "If we're doing this, we need to be smart about it. Supplies, equipment, and people who know what they're doing. But I'll tell you right now, I'm not setting foot back in there unless we're ready." Over the next few hours, they made a list of everything they'd need. Flashlights, helmets, ropes, food, water. Everything for a longer, safer expedition. Matt uploaded the footage to a secure drive, ensuring they wouldn't lose it. As the sun rose higher, they packed up their belongings and checked out of the motel, their minds already focused on what lay ahead. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Corey said as they loaded their gear into the car. "No matter what it takes." Ryan sighed. "Let's just hope we're not making the biggest mistake of our lives." The drive back to the cave's location was uneventful, but tension hung heavy in the air. When they arrived, they parked the car and began the hike toward the marked spot. The forest was quiet, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden beams. But as they neared the spot where the cave entrance should have been, all three of them stopped in their tracks. The entrance was gone. The three friends stood in stunned silence, staring at the patch of forest where the cave entrance had been. The air felt heavier here, and the shadows seemed unnaturally deep despite the midday sun. "It was here," Corey said, his voice breaking the tense quiet. He scanned the area, his eyes darting to every tree, every patch of moss-covered ground. "I marked it on the map. I know this is the spot." Ryan walked forward, his brow furrowed in frustration. "It doesn't make any sense. It's not like a cave can just disappear." He knelt, brushing aside leaves and dirt in a desperate attempt to uncover some trace of the entrance. Matt joined in, his camera slung over his shoulder. "It was right here," he muttered, pulling out his phone to compare the GPS coordinates to the map. The numbers matched perfectly, but the ground was undisturbed. No opening, no fissure, no sign that there had ever been a cave. They searched for hours, expanding their search radius, but the results were the same. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees whispering in a language they couldn't understand. "We didn't imagine it," Corey said firmly, wiping sweat from his brow. "All three of us saw it. We went inside. We have footage to prove it." Matt hesitated. What if it's not gone? What if we just can't see it?" Ryan turned to him, his expression a mix of skepticism and unease. "What are you saying? That it's invisible now?" Matt shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. Maybe the cave wasn't normal. Maybe it was some kind of anomaly, something we weren't supposed to find." Corey shook his head. "That's crazy." "Is it?" Matt shot back. "After everything we saw in there, can you really say that?" As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, they were forced to admit defeat. The cave was gone, vanished without a trace. Defeated, they returned to the car. The ride back to town was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. At the motel that evening, they reviewed the footage again, hoping to find some clue they'd missed. But the images were the same. The eerie creatures, the dark corridors, the glowing eyes. It was all there, proof of what they'd experienced. Yet without the cave, the footage felt hollow. They couldn't lead anyone back to the site. They couldn't verify their story. "People are going to think we're insane," Corey said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Let them," Ryan said. "We know what happened. That's all that matters." The days that followed were filled with doubt and frustration. They shared their story with a few fellow enthusiasts, hoping for support or advice, but the response was lukewarm at best. Most dismissed their tale as a fabrication, a poorly executed prank. But the three friends knew better, Powell, and despite the ridicule and disbelief, they couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was still out there, waiting. The ridicule began almost immediately after they shared their story online. Forums dedicated to caving and amateur spelunking lit up with threads mocking their tale. The footage they posted was scrutinized and picked apart, with most accusing them of using special effects or simply staging the entire thing. Matt slammed his laptop shut after reading yet another dismissive comment. "They're calling us liars. Fraudsters." Corey leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "What did you expect? We can't even prove the cave exists. Of course, they think we're making it up." Ryan, who had been quietly pacing the room, stopped and turned to face them. "Maybe it's time we stop trying to convince anyone else. Let them think what they want. We know the truth." Matt sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But what's the point of knowing if we can't do anything about it? We can't find the cave. We can't prove it's real. It's like it never existed." Corey sat forward, his expression resolute. "Then we find it. Just us. No forums, no teams, no outside help. If it's still out there, we'll find it." The next few days were spent planning their next move. They pored over maps, studied geological surveys, and scoured every resource they could find about the area. "There has to be something," Matt said, his finger tracing the contours of a topographical map. "Some clue, some landmark we missed." "Maybe the cave entrance was a fluke," Ryan suggested, "a sinkhole that opened and then closed again." Corey shook his head. "No, this was different. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was something else, and we're going to find it." The three friends returned to the forest the following weekend, armed with fresh determination and better equipment. They retraced their steps, using every detail they could remember to guide them. But the forest seemed to have changed. Landmarks they'd relied on before were either gone or unrecognizable. Trails that should have led them to the cave twisted and turned in unfamiliar ways. It's like the whole place is working against us, Matt muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Ryan nodded, scanning the dense undergrowth. It's almost like it doesn't want to be found. Hours turned into days as they combed the area, but the cave remained elusive. By the end of their search, they were exhausted and no closer to the truth. As they packed up their gear to leave, Corey paused, looking back at the forest. "I'm not giving up," he said quietly. "I don't care how long it takes. We'll find it." Ryan clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We're with you, no matter what." Though the cave had vanished, their bond as friends grew stronger in their shared determination. And while the world dismissed their story as fiction, the three of them knew the truth. The cave was out there, waiting. The weeks passed in a blur of maps, forest hikes, and quiet determination. The ridicule from others had grown louder, but the three friends refused to let it shake them. They continued their search for the mysterious cave, even though it seemed to slip further away with each failed attempt. Every lead turned cold. Every clue evaporated. They couldn't even find the exact spot where the entrance had once stood. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the cave whole, leaving no trace behind. Yet they couldn't give up. Ryan, Corey, and Matt had become obsessed, their lives revolving around the elusive cave and the strange creatures they'd encountered within it. They pushed forward, day after day, trying to retrace their steps with little to no success. The days turned into months, and still, the cave was nowhere to be found. One morning, Corey stood in front of the old map they'd used to mark the cave's location. His eyes scanned the lines of the topography, the tiny details that seemed so insignificant before. Something caught his eye. A small ridge in the map, just a few miles from where they had last searched. What if we missed something? He asked aloud, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and doubt. Ryan, who had been sitting at the table, looked up. "Missed something? You've been through every inch of that forest." Corey shook his head. "I don't know. This one spot." Matt leaned in, squinting at the map. "What about it?" "I don't know. It's just, there's something about it. I think we've been looking in the wrong area." Ryan stood up, grabbing his jacket. "Let's check it out. What do we have to lose?" They set out early the next morning, driving to the new location that Corey had found. It was a more remote part of the forest, a place they hadn't ventured into before. The trees grew thicker here, their gnarled branches intertwining above to block out the sun, casting everything in a dull greenish haze. As they hiked deeper into the forest, an unsettling quiet settled around them. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their footsteps crunching on the forest floor. "Something feels off," Matt murmured. "It's too quiet." Corey nodded, his gaze scanning the area. "We're getting closer." After a few hours of hiking, they came to a small ridge, the ground sloping steeply downward into a dark hollow. At the bottom of the ridge, something caught their eye, an odd outcrop of rocks that seemed to form a natural arch. "That's it," Corey whispered, his heart racing. "That's where it was. I'm sure of it." Ryan and Matt exchanged glances, and they began to make their way down the slope. As they neared the arch, they noticed something else, a faint, unnatural glow emanating from behind the rocks. "This isn't normal," Ryan said, his voice low. Corey's hand trembled as he reached for his flashlight, and they moved forward cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Suddenly, as they neared the arch, the ground beneath their feet shifted. A loud crack echoed through the air, and before they could react, the earth gave way. They fell, falling, tumbling into the darkness below. Corey, Ryan, and Matt lay still for a moment, stunned by the sudden drop. They had fallen into a large chamber, the walls of the cave curving around them like a giant bowl. The faint glow that had caught their attention earlier illuminated the walls, revealing strange symbols carved into the rock. "Is this it?" Matt gasped, his voice shaky as he got to his feet. Corey stood slowly, scanning the chamber. "It has to be. Look at the markings." Ryan's flashlight swept over the walls, and as it caught the light in a certain way, something moved in the shadows. There, in the far corner of the chamber, they saw it, a figure. A creature, half hidden in the dark, watching them with glowing eyes. The realization hit them all at once. They had found the cave again. And this time, There was no turning back. The end of part 1.